Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to today's meeting on Tunisia after one election and before another election. So we are going to look at whether a viable coalition can be formed, especially since I believe 27 parties are running, having candidates for the presidential elections. We are very fortunate to have with us today two of our colleagues. Robert Worth was in Tunisia during the parliamentary elections and is going to share with us his experience and what he saw on the ground, and Marina Othaway, who returned last night, having spent 10 days in Tunisia en route to somewhere else for 3 days. So it happens really very seldom when we have two speakers coming so straight from the country and the issues we discuss. Rob is a fellow at the Wilson Center currently, and he is a frequent contributor to the New York Times Magazine and has been writing about the Arab world since 2003. At the center, he is working on a book about the 2011 Arab uprising and their legacy. You notice that we no longer refer to it as the Arab Spring, we just say uprising. He reported from Baghdad for the New York Times from 2003 to 2006 and was the paper's bureau chief from 2007 to 2011. And we are delighted to have him with us. Marina Othaway is known in town, around the region, and among all of you. She is a senior scholar at the Wilson Center and a long-time analyst of political transformation in Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. I think the Middle East is taking so much of her time that I don't think she has time to read or work on Africa or the Balkans. At the center, she's working on a project about the countries of the Arab Spring and Iraq. And she joined us after 14 years at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I always say their big loss or great gain. At Carnegie, she launched the Middle East program. And she has been teaching at a number of universities, and she travels a lot in the region, and we are very happy to have these two speakers. Just one note that there is a camera crew who is running late and will walk in at some stage, so don't let it disturb you. You have the floor, Robert.
Thank you, Hala. Is this working? Can everybody hear me? Okay,
it's
good.
working. Oddly enough, it doesn't make sense, but it works.
I should say, first of all, by way of apology, there are people here who know 1,000 times more than I do about Tunisia, a country I first visited after the election of 2011. I got there about a month later. I've been there a couple times since then. So I'm going to just talk about my impressions from the campaign, this latest campaign. First of all, what everybody here knows is that Nida Tunis won. A little bit of background on them, for those who don't know. It was founded in 2012 by Beji Caid Essebsi, who had been prime minister for 9 months prior to the 2011 elections. He is sort of a dinosaur. He's about to turn 88 years old. He held various high positions under Bourguiba and is seen as kind of a representative of the Bourguiba era. He by many people is seen as somewhat tainted because he also served under Ben Ali. Because he didn't serve out his full time and left before the end, he's, to some extent, well, he's less dirty than he could be. Let's put it that way. His party was formed purely as a counter to Ennahda. It's got very little unity ideologically or anything else. It also doesn't really have, as far as I can tell, that much organizational strength. It was, I think, really strengthened in 2013 by sort of increasing the wide sense of outrage at Ennahda. But after the Constitution was passed in beginning of 2014, I think it began to weaken. There was a sense of discontent that the party included too many people from the RCD, Ben Ali's party. Again, the unity that had been formed by anger at Ennahda began to dissolve a little bit. What was clear, if you were in Tunisia the week before the election, was that it was a strange campaign, the Nida Tunis campaign. I'll describe one big rally they held in Sousse, one of the major cities in Tunisia. They had a great big auditorium that they had rented, and they were sort of temporarily blocking people near the entrance, even though the auditorium was completely empty. And I wondered why they were doing this. It wasn't really security checks. And I, at a certain point, decided that this was because they wanted to give the impression of huge crowds dying to get in, when in fact, they never really filled the hall, and they had bussed people in from all over the place. They then played loud sort of pop music, and they had a lot of people, sort of a clack of people waving flags. But the whole thing had a somewhat artificial feeling. And when Essebsi finally came on and spoke, he didn't speak for that long. Now, for a man who's about to turn 88, that's understandable. But they began to leave before he even finished. And much of the rally was taken up with a 25-minute video that was all about Bourguiba, black and white. So there's really a sense in which Essebsi represents Bourguiba. It's as if you were, electing a dead man. And in fact, there was a really kind of macabre moment when after the video, they showed a huge image of Bourguiba's face, which seemed to be a still photo, but it was digitally altered, and it began to speak. The lips began to move. So that was the Nida Tunis. And then meanwhile, Ennahda was running its campaign, which was amazing. They seemed to have people all over the country literally knocking on doors. They had rallies all over the place. And their last major rally in Tunis was a really stark contrast with Nida Tunis's. They had huge crowds of people. The enthusiasm seemed very genuine. It was beautifully organized. They had a great big stage with various dignitaries from Ennahda up front. And two women who were not wearing hijabs prominently featured. One of the things that I find very encouraging generally about Tunisia now is that people want to be in the political center, both sides, which is not something you see in any of the countries that have had uprisings over the past, since 2011. And that's actually to some extent true of both sides. I mean, Nida Tunis makes gestures to constantly say we're Muslim, they feature their women in hijabs, and the other side features their women without hijabs. But this rally was a thing of beauty. They projected real confidence, whereas one of the things that in his brief campaign speech in Sousse, one of the things that Essebsi had said was, if we lose this election, it's going to be Asra Zulumat, the Dark Ages. It's going to be, it was a sense of sort of desperation. If we don't win, forget it. Tunisia's over as a country. And there was almost an exact parallel at this Ennahda rally where one of the speakers, I think it was not Ghanouchi, said, if we lose, well, that's okay. It's a democratic process and we'll still be here. Ghannouchi gave a very long speech. He often does that, but it was good. And one of the things that was striking too, the major criticism leveled last year at Ennahda was that they were, if not exactly complicit in some of the, Salafist attacks and terrorism and the two major political assassinations, but that they weren't strong enough in their counterterrorism rhetoric and efforts. Well, they got that memo. During this rally, every speaker talked a lot about counterterrorism. In fact, they essentially said it was their top priority. And several of them mentioned by name an officer who had died in an attack, well, not an attack, in a raid on a house on the outskirts of Tunis where some jihadis had been holed up, mostly women, interestingly enough. There was a piece about that in today's New York Times. Anyway, the speakers mentioned the officer who had died and said repeatedly he's a martyr for Tunisia. So by the time the election came, despite the polls which suggested that indeed Nidaa Tounes would win, I had the impression of one party that was immensely confident and strong and well organized, and another one that was incredibly weak. One political analyst described Essebsi's party, Nidaa Tounes, memorably to me as an aging lion guiding a pack of errant wolves. Many of the leading figures in Nidaa Tounes are businessmen who don't really have much political experience, and some of them have dirty hands, as they say. Then it was, as I say, something of a surprise that there was a decisive win by Nidaa Tounes. But what I found, and obviously this is as wildly unscientific as anything journalists do, but I spoke to dozens of people around the time of the election, on the election day. Most of them said, I'm going to vote for Nidaa Tounes, but I don't really like them. I'm doing it because I don't want Ennahda to be in charge. Many of them said, I want it for tawazzun, for balance. I don't want anybody to have a dominant position, at least for the next period, which struck me anyway as a sign of political maturity. Now, whether that allows for a governing coalition to form is something Marina is going to address. Let me, in my remaining time, do I have a little more time? Talk a little bit about civil society, where I was really encouraged. During the election, the obvious aspects were some election monitoring groups that did a really good job. Muraqiboon and iWatch and a couple of others did projections that turned out to be right on target. They had a lot of young Tunisians, people who'd been part of the sort of Facebook crowd in 2011, who were involved in this. But what I found most encouraging, perhaps predictably since I'm a journalist, was some of the civic journalism that's going on. As many of you probably, all of you probably know, journalism in the Arab world tends to focus on opinion and on news, and there isn't a lot of serious investigative journalism. There's a group that began working in 2011 called Nawat. It was a blogging collective, and they have evolved into something different. In June, they launched a site called Intifada, which does serious, long-form civic journalism. And I think they're wonderful. They so far it's only in French. They're working on putting it all into Arabic as well. It's not in print. It's just online. But it's really serious, and they cover all kinds of things from garbage collection to counterterrorism. I'll describe a little bit. They did a two-part long investigation on garbage collection, which I thought was fascinating. It looked at, one of the things, the reason it's important is that after 2011, there were piles of garbage, and there still are, all over Tunisia. And it was demoralizing, and for many people seemed like a kind of a symbol of the failure of the revolution. This article looked into exactly how the garbage collection system worked under Ben Ali. In fact, the system was broken back then, but because everyone was afraid in a police state of going on strike, they managed to get by. But the article examined what happened to the collection points, what the involvement of the union was, what the legal situation was, and then what had happened since then, you know, what the failures had been, what legal reforms are necessary, and what the unions and various other sectors could do. And that piece guided the conversation on this issue for about a week, I think, after it came out. It was featured in Tunisian radio, TV, newspaper reports. So I found that enormously encouraging. They've done other things, like a long piece, a sort of map of terrorist incidents in Tunisia since 2011. Interestingly, there haven't really been any terrorist attacks per se since then. There have been assassinations, there have been raids where terrorists appear to be working, but not attacks. At any rate, I don't know how sustainable this is going to be. This Intifada site is actually structured like some of the recent web startups in the U.S., which is that it's a three-part organization called Al Khat. One of those is profit-making and aims to sustain the other two being Intifada, the journalism, and also a training organization, which I think is a wonderful idea because training journalists in, you know, high levels of factual reliability is something you also don't see much. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Marina?
Thank you. I got to Tunisia on this trip, wondering whether the story I had to, the article I would write, the paper I would write coming back, would be a paper on how Tunisians had managed to do through elections what Egyptians did through a military coup d'etat. That is really the pushing the Nahda in a minor position in the political process and the beginning of an exclusion process. I came back from the trip after talking to a lot of people, totally convinced that this is certainly not the case, and in fact that Nida Tounes won much less of a victory than it was represented in the press, that it is not likely to be able to form a stable government coalition without the participation of Nahda. So that paradoxically, there is a good probability that once the government is formed, it will be a government where Nahda plays a political role. People in Nida Tounes admit that this is the case. Nobody wants to talk about an alliance with Nahda. Nobody wants to talk about a partnership with Nahda. But they talk about, well, we will cooperate with them. And then you say, well, what does it mean? Well, they'll have some ministries. Well, that's an alliance as far as I can tell. So that essentially what we are seeing is a political situation which is much more complicated than the victory of Nida Tounes and the defeat of Nahda. Certainly, Nida Tounes' performance was very impressive, despite the lackluster campaigning that we have just heard. And part of the reason why the campaign is so lackluster is that Sebsi does not have the energy to go around campaigning. Even now in the presidential campaigning, there are a lot of videos, but there are not that many public appearances because of his age. And I think you shaved a couple of years off his age. He may be closer to 90 actually although nobody is not totally sure about that. So essentially, what we are seeing a situation in which the two parties are much more balanced than it seemed from the first reports. What is certainly is that it's going to be a very complicated process of forming a government, and in the end, no matter what happens, that government will be based on something that I would call an alliance against nature, because there is no way to. Nida Tounes, the Sebsi had proclaimed that they would form an alliance of like-minded parties. there are not enough like-minded parties to make up the majority. They need 200, there are 217 seats in the parliament. They need 109 to form a majority, and that's a majority of one. I mean, a bare majority, they need considerably more to have a stable majority, essentially. And there are not 120 like-minded people, no matter how you count them. In order to form a coalition without Nahda, Nida Tunis would have to bring in a very strange group of allies. Because if you look at the parties that have the a substantial block of votes, the third one after first is the Nida Tunis, then you have Nahda, and then it drops down considerably. And the third party is the Free Patriotic Union. And the Free Patriotic Union has 16 seats in the parliament. Okay, the Free Patriotic Union is an organization that nobody wants to, that even Nida Tunis is very hesitant in pulling too close to, because it is headed by somebody, I can't remember who it was, unfortunately, told me this is the guy, Slim Rihai, who runs NIDA, that runs the Free Patriotic Union, is Tunisia's Berlusconi. Is a it's a businessman. He owns a football team. He has made his money in Libya under circumstances which are not quite clear. There are a lot, how he made his money, it's not quite clear and so on. He's a rather shady character. He's also running for president now, although he's not given any chance of winning. So it's not the kind of group that anybody really wants to embrace. After this party, after the Free Patriotic Union, you have the Popular Front. And the Popular Front is a coalition. They have 15 seats in the parliament. They are a coalition of small, very leftist parties, and totally unreformed. I mean, there is my impression talking to them, it's like you go back to the European left of the 1950s. They really are groups that belong to another era, down to smoking the Gauloise cigarettes, which I think sort of it's the final, sort of puts the final touch on the whole thing. So, and then there is, and next to them is the party that everybody likes. It's a small party called Afek Tunis, and Afek Tunis is liked both by Nahda and by Nida Tunis. It's a party of professionals, essentially. They are the technocrats, but they only have 8 seats in the parliament, and while everybody likes them, and they are bound to be in any coalition, they certainly will be in a government coalition and probably end up with some of the technical ministries, but there are not enough of them to really make the balance. So essentially, if Nida Tunis brought all those groups together, and they would, and then they pick up some of the people who ran as independent, a few former, they are now called Desturians. Nobody talks about having been a supporter of Ben Ali, but they're all Desturians, that is, supporters of Bourguiba. And if they pick up some of them, yes, they could put together a coalition, but the problem is that a coalition that can govern, because it's that a coalition that has nothing in common. In terms of its economic orientation, Nida Tunis essentially is, a fairly orthodox, free enterprise oriented party, and it's going to have a lot of trouble getting reforms through, the kind of reforms that everybody knows that the Tunisia has to implement through, given the presence of the Popular Front in the alliance. And the Popular Front is just not the Popular Front, which in the end only got about, they got 3.60 4% of the vote. But the Popular Front is also backed by the labor unions. And the labor unions are important, they are organized, and they play an important part in the transition. So there is a leftist force there that would certainly be an obstacle to the implementing of any of the economic reforms. How the government is going to be formed in the end, nobody knows at this point, because Sebsi has made it quite clear that he does not want to discuss the formation of the government until after the presidential election. Presidential elections are this coming weekend, so we'll know at least we'll have a pretty good idea, although we already have a pretty good idea now about what's going to happen. Probably nobody is going to win. There were 27 candidates, they are now down to 25, I think. But they have although there is some confusion because it's not clear whether or not they can actually withdraw. They can stop campaigning, but once the lists are made, they are still on the list. But in any case, clearly most of them are non-starter. The real fight is between Sebsi and the current president, Marzouki, who nobody particularly likes, but he is the non-Sebsi. The same way in which Nahda, the Nida Tunis voted as the group that was not Nahda, as the party that was not Nahda, the Marzouki is, essentially is running because he is not Sebsi, and the votes that he'll get are probably going to be not because of who Marzouki is, but because of the fact that he is not a Sebsi. So it's a very fluid political situation. It is true that Nida Tunis went, as I said, from 0 seats, because they did not exist, to 86 seats in a very short period of time. But it's still, they are not in a position to run the country by themselves. So I think the possibility of the elimination scenario, that is the fact that Nahda is going to be isolated, that Nahda is going to push in a corner, it's going to stop being a political factor, I think seems to be rather remote at this point. The question is, can it really be included in the coalition? And that's the big question, because there are possibly very serious consequences for Nida Tunis if Nahda was included in the coalition, because after all, Nahda, the campaign against, Nida Tunis campaign against Nahda. It was campaign, it is us or the Dark Ages, essentially. And to admit people who represent the Dark Ages in the coalition becomes it's a bit of a challenge. Can they do it? I suspect that in the end they will be forced to do it. And if they do it, I think there are more. It's not that I like necessarily governments of national reconciliation forever. I think governments of national reconciliations are dangerous because you don't have an opposition, first of all, if you have a government of national reconciliation. So they are not a solution forever to the problems of a country, but they may have no choice after this round of election. And we'll see what will happen next. One of the possibilities is, although I think that's fairly remote, is that Nida Tunis will split. Because Nida Tunis is a very uncertain alliance. The party does not exist as a party. I think it's interesting what Robert was saying about the campaigning, because it really does not have party structures. It has never held a Congress. It has never really constituted itself as a political party with a well-organized structure. It's very unclear who would take over if Sebsi should die, which is always a possibility given the age of the guy. And, he will not last forever, although people keep on saying that politics is rejuvenating him. But, there is only so much rejuvenation when you are 90, essentially. There are, as Robert said, there are really 3 different components to Nida. One is that of the people who call themselves the Desturians. And they were mostly supporters of, more of these Desturians. The Destur party was Bourguiba's party, right? And so essentially the Desturians should be the Bourguibist. But real Bourguibists are very old now. So that anybody below a certain age is really more of a Ben Ali person or somebody who started in politics under Ben Ali than somebody who really participated in politics in the Bourguiba period. And that's a very important component of the Nida Tunis. The second component, interestingly, there is a group of leftists that, or former leftists, or semi-leftists at this point. I don't know how to characterize them.
Free market socialists.
No, they are much more than free market socialists. They are still more. They are still more leftist than free market socialists, essentially. That have decided to join Nida Tunis rather than to join the Popular Front. They are probably not as far left as the Popular Front, but they are still in the party. And then there are younger people, essentially, that are against Nahda and gravitated towards Nida Tunis as the only real viable party. Did not want to go with Slim Riahi. They did not want to go with, they are not leftists. They did not go with the Popular Front and so on. So it's a strange organization that will have to consolidate. Nahda has its own problems, but it seems to have made progress. Probably Nahda had its own problems with Salafis in it, that there was a very radical wing that seems to be not as important as it was in the past. So that is, probably the country is going to end up with a coalition of people, and I owe this description to my husband, who sit in the same room pinching their nose, essentially, because they don't like to being together. How it's going to govern such a coalition, I think it remains to be seen. And I think it's important to keep in mind that Tunisia does have very serious economic problems, like all the countries that have had uprisings that they need, and they cannot wait forever to implement the economic reform. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Let me start with a question to you and then to Marina. What I find puzzling is that the description of Nahda Tunis is that they were not necessarily organized. I mean, they had always to give the pretense that there is a large crowd coming. And while Nahda was organized and, genuinely, you said large crowds and so on, and we know that the elections were not rigged. So what happened?
I think Nida Tunis benefited from a lot of residual anger at Nahda. You got to remember in 2013, those two big political assassinations, Shokri Belaid and Brahmi, one in February, one in July, really made people fear that the country was, heading for the brink, and there was. If you talk to Rashid Khanouchi about this, he'll say, the Nida Tunis, or anybody who was in that camp, was looking at Egypt and copying exactly what they saw. They formed a National Salvation Front. You could almost smell a coup coming. But luckily, politics are different in Tunis. And then you had, this rapprochement with the two leaders, Khanouchi and Essebsi, meeting personally, starting in August 2013, and that sort of brought the tensions down. But still, there was a really strong sense of anger at Nahda. And so I think, they ended up benefiting despite the sort of near absence of a real campaign.
Marina, in the upcoming presidential elections on Sunday, can you explain a little bit the process? I mean, does the candidate need what kind of majority does a candidate need not to go to the second round? And what will happen if they go to the second round? And is the president the person who is going to choose the prime minister? And must the prime minister be part of his party? Or if there is going to be a coalition, what sort of bargaining will go on there?
Okay. Okay, thank you. Let me just add something to what Robert said. I think it's important to keep in mind that no matter how well organized NACDA is, there are plenty of people who hate NACDA because it's an Islamist party. I mean, there are a lot of people who fear NACDA, and that's why this exclusion scenario, there is no doubt that there are people who do believe that NACDA would take the country back to the Dark Ages. And, and no matter how NACDA behaves, I think plenty of people will still believe that. So that in that sense, my reaction to the election results was NACDA did better than I expected, rather than worse than expected, in the sense that the party in power always gets punished, essentially. Granted that they were not in power any longer because NACDA had stepped down in favor of a technocratic government that made a huge concession. But essentially, I think it's important to keep in mind that people really, there are plenty of people in Tunisia that really do feel fear NACDA, and that's why the prospect of a coalition, of some sort of an arrangement, I will not use the word coalition, but sort of an arrangement between NACDA and Nida Tounes is so threatening to a lot of people and so strange. Now, concerning the presidential election, it's very simple. First round, unless somebody gets more than 50% of the vote, the absolute majority in the first round, it goes to a second round. So, and that's why it's fairly likely that we'll go to a second round, because no matter how many candidates, whether the candidates are down to 22 or 20 or whatever it is, there are still a lot of them. And although most of them don't have a prayer to really make a good showing, they will still steal some votes here and there, and therefore it is unlikely that although it is possible that there will be. Now, what power does the president have? He has the power in terms of mostly in terms of security and foreign affairs. That's really the main area in which the president, as president, has very important powers. And then he is the one who the government has to be backed by the parliament. It has to obtain the majority of vote in the parliament. But it is the president that nominates the prime minister who is going to try and form the government. In that sense, it's a pretty standard parliamentary system. What is going to be complicated, it's not just the sharing of power within the cabinet, but also in other organizations. For example, a big issue now is who is going to get the speakership of the parliament, the presidency of the parliament, if you want. That is also going to be up for grab among political parties, and I think it's all going to be a very complicated, the sharing of positions when finally the government is formed.
Question to both of you. What is the future of Ghannouchi, given Nahda's loss? And what is puzzling to me is that why does he write an op-ed I'm sorry. I asked what is the future, the way my two speakers see the future of Ghannouchi. And what is puzzling is that he writes op-eds for the American press, I mean, rather than writing something. I'm sure he writes for the Tunisian press too, but why here?
Well, it's interesting, the contrast with the Muslim Brotherhood. I think, and Nahda is much more sophisticated and much more internationally aware. And there is a belief, as there is in Egypt, that no matter what anyone may say, there's, secret determinative role being played here in Washington, that you have to make sure you're on the good side of people here. So they've hired a Washington lobbyist He's traveled a number of times, I think, hasn't he? Several times anyway, to Washington and New York. He has a very, very smart, sophisticated entourage. I think Ghannouchi, being the guy who founded the party and has remained at the center of it, his family members, his son is his chief of staff. There are others are involved as well. Unlike Nida Tounes, there are other people who play important roles and who are capable. Ali Larayed, who was the interior minister, certainly has a future in Tunisian politics. But I don't see the loss, the relative loss, again, as Marina says, of Ennahda posing any problems for Ghannouchi. I think, though, the internal politics of Ennahda are somewhat opaque. It's interesting, after it became clear that they had not won the election, they disappeared for a while. They had promised interviews to various people, including me, and which all that was canceled. They didn't do much on television. They seemed to be having this sort of conclave to decide what the future held for them, and they seem to be very disciplined about this. They sort of have these internal discussions. I mean, in the past, we've been aware of internal differences in Ennahda. When Ghannouchi decided to respond in August of 2013 to Essebsi's call for a dialogue, there were some in the party who didn't want that because, they saw him as this tainted Ben Ali era figure, and we have electoral legitimacy, the same thing that was said by the Brotherhood in Egypt. Why should we make compromises? Even talking to him is some kind of compromise. But Ghannouchi has enormous heft in the party, and I don't see him being weakened.
I tend to agree with that. I think, the party sees itself as making a comeback. In other words, this is not a party that behaves, by the time I got to Tunisia a little later, they were talking to people again. So it was possible to have meetings. And they certainly don't talk as a party that does not believe it has a future. They are talking as a party that sees itself making a comeback, and we have to, to organize, we have to continue, and so on. I think Ghannouchi has a very important role to play, because although Ennahda is nowhere nearly as divided as Nida Tounes is. It's not as fragile as Nida Tounes, which is really, it's an alliance that is held together by its enemy more than by what it believes. I think in the case of Ennahda, yes, there is a program, if you want, but there are also divisions, and those came out very clearly when Ennahda decided to allow the formation of a technocratic government. Some people left the party and so on. So Ghannouchi still plays a very important role in holding the party together, and I think he has done that quite capably.
Thank you. We are opening it for Dan. Just wait for the mic. It's right behind you. Thank you.
My sense is that...
Dan Bromberg from
Hi,
USAP.
Dan Bromberg, USAP. My sense is that the outcome was partly affected by the decline of youth vote, although it's hard to know exactly where it would have gone had the number of youth who didn't vote actually participated in the election, but it was a very significant decline. And this sort of youth vote seems to me to be a wild card out there that we have to contemplate in terms of a possible comeback, too. It's a very interesting phenomenon. But I also wanted to get a sense of how you two view the campaign of Marzouki now, the presidential campaign. There's talk about sort of demonizing the enemy. I mean, you get a lot. I mean, I've been watching the videos of his most recent speeches, which are quite extraordinary. And in each speech, there are 7 Marzoukis that come out, depending at which point you're watching the speech. And some of those Marzoukis are a little disappointing, I have to say personally, because there's a lot of populist rhetoric in there, and some of it I'm not sure he actually believes in, but that's hardly the first time a politician has done that. But it certainly does have some implications about the formation of a coalition if, in fact, you're now with the shoes on the other foot, and you're saying, well, the comeback of this party is the Dark Ages. Before it was the opposite. So I wondered whether you had any inclination as to how that would, and Monica's here too, might want to say something. I'm interested in how that might affect this. I think a coalition government is the only way to go if they're serious about economic reform. I mean, one can't imagine anything else, right? Anyway, thank you.
Marina?
Yeah. First of all, on the issue of the youth vote, I'm not sure that the youth vote really affected Nahda as much as other parties. I think what the fact that the youth vote is down means that the youth does not identify with Nida Tounes, which is not too strange, given that, that it's really a party. So that essentially, so far, there has not been anybody to pick up, essentially, the people who want to change, who want to go somewhere. Afek Tunis is too technocratic partly for that. They're very interesting people, and I really, when I talk to them, I like what I see. I think they're very serious about what they are trying to do, but it's not a party that has very wide spread popular appeal. Essentially, they don't talk that way. Marzouki, yeah, I don't think anybody has a great deal of confidence in Marzouki. The Shura Council, Nahda Shura Council decided not to endorse anybody. There is an assumption that a lot of people of Nahda supporters might vote for Marzouki because they don't want to vote for Sabsi and there is nobody else to vote for. But I think Marzouki did not get much, popularity while he has been president now for a while. And and I'm trying to be polite. I mean, he is a somewhat a scary person in that sense, because it seems to be rather erratic in what he says and the positions he takes.
The youth?
Yeah. With the youth, it's interesting. I tend to agree with Marina. I mean, I think more of the youth that I spoke to there said that they would vote for Nida if they voted, but the overall view did tend to be, we don't like either of them. They both represent something old and sort of hidebound, and we want to get rid of them. And one person, actually, this is a guy who works for Intifada, said, we just want to keep them in balance until they get old and die, so that we can move on to the next generation of leaders. So let's keep them sort of competing with each other for a while. As for Marzouki, it's interesting you should say scary. I mean, I talk to a lot of people who made fun of him, and I think he has been mocked. Exactly. I mean, there's been an enormous amount. If you watch some of these, if you YouTube some of the, Tunisian talk shows, people love to make fun of him. And in a more serious vein, some people say they feel he sort of diluted the gravity of the position of president. So I think certainly if he wins, it's going to be faute de mieux.
Okay, yes, please. Just wait for the mic and identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Monica Marks from Oxford University. Thank you both for some really fascinating insights. Robert, I've been to many Nida Tounes rallies where Essebsi is speaking in front of floating golden heads projected behind him, golden heads of Bourguiba, of course. I have campaign literature, a stack of it at home in Tunis with, Bourguiba's picture imposed on, Essebsi, and these kind of fade outs, and, it's really amazing, the extent to which the man emulates the personal politics. First, to respond to Daniel on Marzouki, and then I have a question for each one of you.
First put your questions, please.
Sure, I'll
because
put
we are
my
running
questions
out
first.
of
Got you,
time.
okay.
Just
Great.
questions. Thank you.
Okay, Robert, first of all, just to play devil's advocate with your idea about civil society and media. The civil society organizations you mentioned are wonderful, iWatch and Morakibun. But they're young, they're not establishment civil society organizations, they're marginal. The establishment civil society organizations in Tunisia tend to be much more afraid of Islamism than authoritarianism, and admit openly that they're in a honeymoon period now that the Islamists are out of power. To what extent are those civil society organizations, many of which were tacitly allied with Ben Ali, going to really press back against the new government, especially considering their silence on some of the abuses, including police impunity, closure of associations without due process under the Mehdi Jama government? Same goes for media. Nawat and Intifada are my favorite outlets, but they're highly intellectual and highly marginal. Pretty much they're preaching to the choir. Nobody reads them. The mainstream organizations, radio and television especially, are controlled by the same people who controlled them under the old regime. And they're pumping out lots of often pro-Nidat Tunis propaganda, which leads me to just a side point about Marzuki. Marzuki does make many populist claims. He does position himself as the clear alternative to a return of the old regime. There are posters around town saying 17 plus 14 minus 7 equals 24, his number. So the idea is that Essebsi equals the RCD, and this is a little bit overly simplistic on some level, although very true on other levels. But just an injection of color from listening to Tunisian radio a lot. Lots of prominent radio programs that get much more pro-Nidat Tunis play than pro-Marzuki play are characterizing Marzuki as a person who supports terrorism. So they're going very far. Quick question for Marina. You have really emphasized the extent to which coalition building might be done on the basis of economically pragmatic reasons. But I'd like to question that. I think it's entirely possible. I think it's entirely possible and very smart. But I'd like to question it just because we've seen lots of critical alliances that are economically unpragmatic. In fact, very counterintuitive. Look at the strange bedfellows in the National Dialogue Quartet between UTICA, the Employers Union, and UGTT. Inside Nidat Tunis, you have an alliance between leftists and old regime business people. We've seen lots of leftists make decisions not based on economic rationales, but based on their hatred of the Islamists.
I did not say that, that I expect the coalition to be built on economic rational grounds. What I said is that whatever coalition is formed will have to tackle the economic problems, and some of the coalitions, it might be very difficult for a coalition that will probably end up by having, you know, a number of very strange bedfellows in it to carry out a consistent economic policy. So I don't believe for a moment that it's going to be the economic problems that are going to drive the building of the coalition. About civil society, of course the old organizations are still there. There was a very clear decision taken by the Constituent Assembly not to ban the members of the old regime. And that's why they are in the parliament, that's why they are all over the place, including in civil society. That's going to be the challenge in the years to come, but there is certainly no doubt that there has not, you know, the uprising has not created tabula rasa. They are all still there.
I think what you said about civil society and media sounds absolutely right. I guess, for me, though, the fact that those few organizations are there at all is what's encouraging and surprising. I mean, having lived for years myself in Beirut, and you know, where there's sort of 2 television stations per person, more or less, and still you don't find people doing that kind of work. So I just love to know that there's somebody trying it at all. I mean, one of the guys who worked for Nawad and now works for Intifada was describing a project in which he spent 3 weeks trying to map out the Interior Ministry. Not even the names, but just the positions and how it all worked. I'd never heard anyone even talk about that, you know, in any Arab country. So that's nice to know that it's possible.
At least in Tunisia.
Yeah.
We have time for one question. Yes.
Radwan Masmoudi with Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. A brief comment and then a brief question. First of all, on the victory of Nida in the elections. In a way, I think that they have to thank Nahda because their campaign was so successful that it scared a lot of people. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but they had huge meetings in which there was 20,000, 30,000 people. And a lot of Tunisians got scared from that. They said, oh, Nahda is coming back even stronger than they were before. And they all voted for Nida to balance Nahda. And really the surprising thing is how poorly all the other parties did. You know, that now we basically have just these 2 parties that are dominating the political scene. My question is about the presidential elections And my fear, and a lot of Tunisians' fear, is if Sibsi wins, then Nida basically controls all levers of the government and of power in Tunisia. In particular, one of the main roles of the president in the constitution is not only that he can veto laws, which means then they need 2/3, but he's also the protector and the guarantor of the constitution. And if Nida Tunis controls the presidency, then there is nobody to check on them. There is nobody to stop these laws. The constitution is fine, but all the laws now that we have on the books in Tunisia are basically unconstitutional. They all have to be changed to be made in line with the new constitution. This is going to obviously take years, but the fear is that the laws will be changed and the constitution will be interpreted in a way that actually restricts the achievements or the protections of the constitution. So is this fear exaggerated, or is it okay if one party dominates the parliament and the government and the presidency at the same time at this stage?
You want to go first?
I mean,
Then
Marina knows more about
Marina.
this than I do. It's certainly a good question. My guess is that, just as Marina said, it's possible that Nida Tunis might fall apart, that I'd be surprised if he's able to ride roughshod over that large a segment of the parliament. But let me see what you think.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the question is not whether it's okay or it's not okay. I mean, question is what elections, how people are going to vote. Is it worrisome that if Sibsi wins? I think the problem still remains, that they are going to have a lot of trouble governing by themselves. I don't think the idea that, the president can veto laws, but first they have to pass some laws before he can veto any laws. And it seems to me that laws will have to be based on some form of compromise. I think what is more likely to happen is, if they don't succeed in putting together a strong coalition, is that a lot of the things that need to be done are not going to be done. In other words, that the laws are not going to be revised, that they are, and as a result, that much of the constitution, in fact, is going to remain dead letter because you don't have the loi cadre that are needed to implement it, and so on, that economic reform is not going to be carried out. I see that more of a problem, frankly, in the coming months than the sort of a new, neither through the control of the presidency and of the parliament acting in a dictatorial manner, because I don't think they have the votes to be able to do that. So yes, it's worrisome, but I don't think it's as dire as you make it out to be, I think. I'm more optimistic, let me put it that way.
I think it's not a very optimistic ending that we have to wait.
Well, the politics is always complicated. I mean,
Please join me in thanking our two speakers. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Monica, we didn't catch you in Tunis, and we caught you here.
So,
I'll be here for a few days.
Italy, Fraction Coalition.